Welcome back to Blood Moon Chronicles.
Chapter 30, The Static God's Last Stand. The air in the chamber didn't just smell like death, it smelled like static. You know that sound a TV makes when you've tuned it to a dead channel? That high-pitched, brain-melting hiss? Imagine that, but instead of sound, it was the entire atmosphere trying to eat your soul. Victor, or whatever was left of him under those fancy rags, wasn't really standing anymore. He was more of a glitch in reality. He looked like a man who had been partially erased by a cosmic pencil, his edges blurring into gray, vibrating smears of shadow and light. He wasn't just a vampire or a werewolf anymore, he was an error in the code of the universe. "You're too late," the thing that used to be Victor said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the walls, the floor, and the very marrow in my bones. It sounded like 1,000 radio stations playing at once, all screaming different news reports. The loop, it doesn't need to be broken, it just needs to be fed. "Well, joke's on you, Gandalf," Bubba barked, stepping forward with the kind of reckless confidence usually reserved for people who have already died once today. He wasn't holding a weapon, he was holding a massive rusted-out control panel he'd ripped from the wall, looking like he was about to use it as a blunt instrument. "We aren't here to follow your script, we're here to cancel the show." "He's right," Rhonda said, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. She stepped up beside Bubba, her eyes fixed on the pulsing, red-veined core of the machine behind Victor. "The harvest ends tonight." I looked at them, this motley crew of survivors and lunatics, and I felt that familiar dry sense of humor bubbling up through my terror. Great, I thought. We're going to die fighting a glitchy shadow god with a piece of junk metal and a man who thinks cigars are a food group. "The mechanism," the warden's voice boomed. He was standing just outside the reach of the static, his form more solid than it had ever been. He looked less like a ghost and more like a man made of heavy stone. "The tooth-slotted drive. It is the anchor. If you don't destroy the core, he will bridge the gap." Victor's form suddenly expanded. The room stretched, the walls pulling back like skin being peeled from an apple. He became a towering pillar of gray noise, a localized storm of pure, unadulterated chaos. "Then let there be light," Bubba yelled. He didn't wait for a response. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Molotov cocktail. Not just any cocktail, but one he'd spent the last 10 minutes concocting from high-proof moonshine and whatever flammable sludge was leaking from the walls. With a roar of pure, unadulterated stupidity, he hurled it directly into the center of the static mass. The explosion wasn't enchantment. It wasn't just fire, it was a violent chemical scream that tore through the silence. The flames caught on the edges of Victor's form, turning the gray static into a swirling vortex of orange and black. "Now," I screamed, lunging toward the control panel, the one that looked like a slot machine made of molars. It was a nightmare of a task. Every time I tried to touch the controls, my hands felt like they were passing through them. The buttons were cold, vibrating with a frequency that made my vision go blurry. "The lever!" Rhonda shouted, pointing toward a heavy bone-white handle protruding from the floor. "It's not a button, Mike. It's a physical reset." Mike scrambled toward it, his face a mask of grim determination. He grabbed the handle with both hands, his boots sliding on the slick, bloody floor. "Come on, you piece of junk," he grunted, his muscles bulging, his teeth bared in a snarl that was far too close to the monster we were fighting. The static god let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a star collapsing. The room began to shake, not like an earthquake, but like it was being shaken by a giant hand. Dust and bits of ancient, fleshy masonry rained down on us. "Hold on," I yelled, grabbing onto a nearby pillar. With one final desperate heave, Mike pulled. There was a sound like a massive rusted bolt being ripped from its socket, a screeching metallic agony that seemed to last an eternity. The light that followed wasn't the red of the blood moon or the white of the warden's presence. It was a blinding, terrifying gold. It rushed into the room, filling every crack and crevice, erasing the shadows and the blood and the terror. I felt myself being lifted off the ground, weightless, as if the entire world had suddenly turned into nothing but light. And then, just before everything went black, I heard Victor's voice one last time. It wasn't angry anymore, it was just tired. Finally, it whispered through the static. Chapter 31, The Long Walk Through the Ashes of Reality. I'm not saying that life is unfair. I am saying that if life were a buffet, we would have been served a plate of live grenades and lukewarm, unidentifiable mystery meat instead of the promised steak. We were walking, not journeying toward glory or making a heroic trek across the wasteland kind of walking. No, this was the heavy, soul-sapping trudge of people who have spent far too much time being chased by things that shouldn't exist and then realized they forgot to turn off the stove before the apocalypse started. The streets of Wolfsbane Falls didn't look like a town anymore. They looked like an artist's attempt at drawing a nightmare using only charcoal and bad intentions. The crimson glow of the blood moon had faded into a bruised, sickly purple, the kind of color you see when you accidentally punch yourself in the eye. If anyone says, "Are we there yet?" I am going to personally ensure your next reincarnation is as a sentient piece of moldy sourdough, Mike muttered. He was stumbling along, his silhouette looking ragged and thin against the wreckage of an overturned school bus. Since everything went sideways with the pocket dimension, he looked less like a man and more like a sketch that someone had partially erased. "Nobody is asking, are we there yet, Mike?" Rhonda said, her voice as dry as a desert bone. She was still limping, not because of the wound, but because the very concept of walking seemed to have become an insult to her dignity. "We're just walking. It's called locomotion. Look it up." "Locomotion is for people who aren't currently being haunted by the echoes of a cosmic static god," Mike snapped back. I stayed in the back, mostly because my brain was pretty sure it had officially left the building about 3 chapters ago. I was busy staring at my hands. They weren't shaking, which was a miracle, but they felt heavy, like my fingers were made of lead and my soul was made of wet cement. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see darkness, I saw that damn obelisk. I saw the way it pulsed, like a giant black heart beating in time with my own terrified pulse. "Hey Doc," Bubba called out from up ahead. He was actually doing some light jogging, which felt entirely unnecessary given that we were all pretty much walking corpses. He stopped and pointed toward what used to be a Megamart parking lot. "You think they have any of those little powdered donuts left? The ones that taste like cardboard and broken dreams?" "Bubba, if you don't stop talking about breakfast food while we are literally navigating a graveyard of reality, I will let the next shapeshifter eat you," Rhonda said, though there was no real bite to it. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was that heavy, pressurized silence that happens right before a storm, or right before something with too many teeth decides to make an appearance. The debris of the town, the shattered glass, the rusted car frames, the occasional charred remains of someone's bad decisions, lay scattered across the road like offerings at an altar we hadn't asked for. We passed what used to be a diner. I could see through the broken window to the booth where we had sat just a few chapters ago. The menu was still there, stuck to a plate, but it looked different now. The ink seemed to be moving, forming words that whispered things like, "No refills," and "help us." "Don't look at it," Mike whispered, his voice cracking. "If you look at the weirdness starts looking back. It's a rule. I read it on a forum once." "You don't read forums, Mike. You read textbooks to avoid talking to people," Rhonda replied. I looked up at the sky. The moon was still there, hidden behind a veil of thick, sulfurous clouds. It felt like we were being watched. Not by a person or even a monster, but by the very air itself. Every breath I took felt borrowed. Every step felt like an intrusion. We weren't just survivors. We were ghosts who hadn't quite figured out how to stop haunting the living. I wonder, Bubba said suddenly, his voice unusually quiet as he stared at a pile of ash that used to be a mailbox. If it ever stops, the loop, the hunger, all of it. Rhonda didn't answer immediately. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the bruised purple sky met the jagged remains of the skyline. It doesn't stop, Bubba, she finally said, and there was a weight in her voice that felt heavier than all the lead in the world. You don't fix a nightmare by waking up. You just learn to sleep through it. I wanted to say something witty. I wanted to make a joke about how my sleeping habits were actually quite professional and well documented. But as the static began to hiss in the distance, calling us back toward a destiny we had already lived 1,000 times, I realized I didn't have any jokes left. We just kept walking. Through the ash, through the blood, through the long, echoing silence of everything we had lost.
Please stay tuned for the next thrilling episode of Blood Moon Chronicles.